You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Welcome to our Inspiring Leaders podcast today. We're talking about how CEOs can use the insights and experience of the board when it comes to navigating risk. To talk us through this, we have Maria Kyriacou, who's chair of ProSiebenSat.1 Media SE. Maria is also a NED at Informa, and in her exec career, her roles included Paramount's president of broadcast and studios for international markets and president of international ITV studios, where she oversaw its international production business and worldwide distribution arm. Joining Maria, we have Giles Thorley, who is CEO of Development Bank of Wales. Prior to this role, Giles spent 5 years as a partner at the PE firm TDR Capital. Before that, he spent 9 years with Punch Taverns plc, initially serving as executive chair for the first year and subsequently as chief executive following the company's IPO. So lots to draw on there. Welcome, Giles and Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. We're doing this podcast from our CEO retreat, where we've just finished the day session. So I might pull in some of the things that we've discussed during the day. But look, I mean, we're looking at risk, and sort of the way it's such a big topic. So we thought just to sort of help frame it is, what do you think CEOs and senior execs often see as the role of the board when it comes to risk management? And I can see you two looking at each other, but I'll pick on Giles first for this.
Thank you. Yes. Honestly, I fear that if my colleagues were here, they would think it would be very much corporate governance approach to risk, so risk registers, etc. I don't think they perceive the board thinking in a holistic way about the overall risks of the business. It's a little too formulaic. So yes, that would be my concern.
Just seeing the board as something to be fed, effectively.
Yes, and I think to a certain extent, not completely, because we've had we have excellent NEDs. There is a bit of, but as your question was, it was from the senior executives. I think there's a sort of feeling that it's a bit of a tick boxing exercise, which it shouldn't really be.
Okay, Maria, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I've only recently migrated from executive to board, and I think that my attitude has changed ever so slightly, but not too much, you'll be pleased to hear, in that it's not just about what the CEO and what the internal people expect of the board. It's also what the regulators expect from the boards and what the shareholders expect, the proxy advisors. And we have and are still going through a period where there's increased pressure on the board to avoid mistakes, to compensate in all sorts of ways for past failures in businesses, and almost feel like you're insuring shareholders against, and not just shareholders, but employees and other stakeholders against those mistakes. Now I've come from an industry that is having to change very, very rapidly. Media has to transform, and I would say that it is dangerous to go too far down the road of a board stopping action and preventing it and policing it and not allowing certain levels of risk to take place. Therefore, I would say that what we're striving for at the board level is a clear understanding of the risk appetite rather than a prevention of all risk. A prevention of all risk means inaction.
Have you made changes to help facilitate that kind of dynamic around risk?
A lot of that changes in the people themselves. It's a cultural change. It's a willingness for a transparent and open discussion. and it's a willingness to debate pros and cons. And some of what's coming at us at the moment, not just the industries I'm involved in, but I think all industries, such as AI, is forcing us to rethink how you balance opportunities and risks, and not to set the board as the policeman and the management team as the go get the opportunities, but to try and balance both the governance and the realization of the opportunities in a mirrored way at the board level and in the team itself.
So you can't, as a board, you can't slow it down too much because you'll miss the opportunities.
Well,
but
probably one of the biggest risks is actually slowing it down, because in an industry that is managing the challenges of structural risk and structural decline, slowing it down is as big a risk as any of the others.
Yeah, but are you finding that as chair then, getting the pace around the sort of the appetite for risk? Because I think some of the sessions that we've had, you can get tension on the board between the executives wanting to go faster, the non-execs saying, "Oh, hold on here," and that can cause some interesting conversations, shall we say.
I've definitely found myself in a situation, especially at the audit committee, where we are in deep on what are the governance around AI, what are the rules, how are we stopping people from using AI, et cetera, and you've almost had to stop that conversation and say, wait a minute, don't we first need to establish what we're trying to do with AI, and then come back to, and how do then you manage the risk and actually identify the risk quite cleally, right? What are you trying to avoid? Data leaks, breaches of law and regulation. We sometimes find, or I have definitely found, that we're going the wrong way around. We start with governance and then we go, wait a minute, hold on, let's go back to the beginning. What are we actually trying to achieve with the implementation of AI?
Okay. Giles, did you have anything to add to
that? No, I think the board has, in our organisation, we started from scratch with a blank sheet of paper to create the development bank. We had a very small financing organisation that had no real corporate governance structures at all. So the board was incredibly helpful. One of our early non-execs, was fantastic in helping us to develop the whole structure of thinking about risk for the organisation. I mean, it's something I'm used to in other places, but with pre-AI, you can't go and sort of write a risk structure. It was a big piece of work that was done, and so we're really benefiting from that. And then I think now what we've got is we're trying to become much more expansive and trying to use the board, and the board are really aspiring to provide that drive to do things differently, to grow our aspirations, but at the same time understanding what the consequences risk-wise of that is.
And that's specifically to AI you're talking?
No, not just AI. I mean, I would say that my experience of most boards that I've been on is that the board is, how do I put this politely?
It's variable, isn't it?
More mature, and therefore generally less well endowed on the opportunities of AI than the executives. So we've actually, on AI specifically, we actually did a training program for the board to give them an understanding of what AI could do. But I mean, honestly, that was 6 months ago, so we're already decades out of date in AI terms. Yeah. So I do worry that boards tend to pick from a relatively small class or small sector of experience, and actually the type of experience you need now is very different. And in fact, my former chair was extraordinarily demanding in making sure that we got board directors, particularly from Wales, who didn't have board experience, to try and bring in entrepreneurs and people with who were more likely to be our customers, to give us a better perspective on what was the challenge. Entrepreneurs, small business owners, etc. And we've definitely benefited from that, because they're much more likely to be using AI on a day-to-day basis than a grandee who's now in a sort of plural board career. And I'm not trying to offend anybody on my board. They've all been excellent.
I mean, you've worn multiple hats. I mentioned sort of punched havens. You had the highly senior role in private equity. What's your perspective or do you have an example of where you've worked as a CEO with a board and they've really helped you, sort of your thinking, your process around risk, and where you've actually found it to be a productive conversation that's maybe helped you, like you kind of leveraging the board in the right way rather than seeing it as something to be fed?
Yes, I mean, I think, both at Punch Taverns and at the Development Bank, I've been extremely lucky that the board has supported the ambition. I think I would say in both cases they probably didn't think that the sort of ambition I had was actually going to come to pass, and we probably exceeded their expectations and mine. But they were very supportive of that. But they also, there were times when we probably went. There were at least a couple of transactions where I think they felt uncomfortable, and they set sort of guide rules as to how that transaction would take place, and we were able to satisfy them on that front. So, I've generally found the boards that I've worked with to be incredibly supportive, but being that moral compass on the risk and the opportunities that we're facing. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, this question to both you really. So the level of risk and volatility can seem overwhelming, and I was mindful of the conversation this morning. You probably know where I'm going with this, because we talk about the risk landscape today, and obviously you've got geopolitics, you've got cyber, whatever sort of lane you look at, you can see the risks there. And a comment was made that this is probably the most challenging time for a CEO at the moment. And Giles, you didn't necessarily agree with that, did you?
So I've been a CEO for almost 30 years, and I've seen a heck of a lot of issues, industry specific and geopolitical, like the global financial crisis, like COVID, and like the situation now. So I can only tell you from my perspective that the GFC was a far, far more serious issue than this. And is that because I'm more mature and I don't worry as much? A little bit. But actually, the overall dynamics are fundamentally better now than they were at that moment. So, I fundamentally disagree that this is not a particularly bad moment in world history. It might seem so if you've not experienced a significant upheaval that much before. But my perception is that it really isn't that bad.
I mean, as a chair, how are you managing that conversation with the exec team? How are you trying to get that thinking between, okay, this is the short term, this is the medium, but this is kind of where we need to be investing and thinking about?
My main contact is the CEO. It's that relationship that's all important, and I think I'm lucky in that I have CEOs, or I've worked with people who like the challenge. They actually like the debate. They're not blocking it, and it happens on a one-to-one environment, a safe environment. So you're striving for a high degree of openness to the discussion. On the one hand, and on the other hand, you are also at times acting as a protector around the CEO and the management team to make sure that they can carry on and do what they need to do, and they're not being unnecessarily asked too many questions when it's not really relevant to the discussion at the board level. I think there's something you said earlier about the skills and experience of the board. And I agree and disagree. I mean, I agree that we need to keep thinking about who's around that table and actually treat it much more in the future, treat it the same way you would treat a management team, developing them, checking, has everyone got the right experiences and skills around the table to make this meaningful? And you need to invest in that development by educating the people around that board and spending time with them to make sure they understand exactly what the business is going through. But at the same time, you can never expect them to know as much as the management team. You should never have that expectation. Right. And that applies to, in my mind, that applies to AI as well. AI is not it's not about, writing complex software. It's about working out what you want the business to achieve and where does AI fit into that solution, not,
making sure you've asked the questions.
Right. We're not a software company, right? That's not what we do. Therefore, the technical expertise at the board level, I'd question it. I'm looking for people who have the right mindset, who are willing to challenge, who are willing to educate themselves and do the reading, do the background before they come into the room, but really, really press on how does this change the business rather than specifics around AI.
Yeah. I think it's interesting with the Chair Ready program that we run. There's a comment about one of the sessions we were talking about having a designated expert on your board, and the comment from the chairs is like, no, you're giving yourself a totally false sense of security, and it's actually diminishing the sense of collective responsibility around the table.
There's a mirroring aspect, which I've said before, which you wouldn't just put one AI person in an organisation and say, that's it, I've fixed AI, I've got one person. I think the same is true around the board table. You can't say, I've just hired someone from an AI firm, I'm done. You have to make sure that every single person around that table is thinking in a way that is up to date and is challenging in the right way.
Yeah, and that's more broadly as well about how they're approaching risk.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on,
Yes.
you're smiling.
No.
You're smiling.
I'm in violent agreement with that. The interestingly, we had the development bank's been in existence for almost 10 years now. So we've gone through the first cycle of directors who've done 9 years, and I mentioned one of them, but a couple of them retired by rotation after their 9-year stint, including the chair, and they were gentlemen of a certain age and felt that the thing that they were leaving behind was weaker because they didn't have some grey hair. We didn't have enough grey hair around the table, and that the mere fact that they'd been around the block meant that they were just better at sort of at understanding the risk, and they just had more life experience. And I think to a certain extent that's true, and they were incredibly useful directors. But equally, I think now they probably would be out of touch with some of the things that we're dealing with, that we've talked about on this podcast. So it is getting the right balance. It's certainly not getting one person who can answer the question. I was on a board, a FTSE 100 company, 18 directors. They had a person who was hired because that individual was a pension expert. They had a person who was an HR director, or would now be a chief people officer of a very large corporate that dealt with P&D, and so on. I don't know what I was there for. I was a precocious, annoying brat who asked all the difficult questions.
You were a young blood.
And then 18 people. You got to the board meetings and half of them had not even read the board papers. It used to drive me spare. Absolutely spare. This was a FTSE 100 company, and the chair would suddenly on a whim decide that the board meeting that was scheduled for the next day in London should actually instead be in Mallorca, and so we'd all trot off to Biggin Hill to be flown to Mallorca for the board meeting. It was absurd.
So was that a good or bad thing?
No, it's completely absurd. So but they took it upon them. They believed that with 18 people, they had great coverage and they had great experience and actually the board was terrible.
Yeah, that feels quite topic to me. Look, I wanted to ask about culture as a risk, because again, when we spoke before, I thought you were pretty passionate on the topic of culture, and I think I used the word staff, and I think you mentioned your comment about colleagues, which you might flesh out. But culture as a risk from a board perspective, and the board's questioning about the culture of the organisation, the role of the chair in sort of getting, I guess, triangulating some of the information they're getting from the senior executives to see, is what I'm being told correct? If I go to you, Giles, on that first, do you have any thoughts about that? Because you have been a chair.
Yeah, look, I think my chair has been fantastic. She's really engaged with the business. My previous chair was similarly engaged, so that they really they spent a lot of time getting to know people well beyond me, and I'm not worried about them seeing anybody in the organisation to find out what the culture's like. But equally, I'm acutely aware that subtle things can change culture. So, for example, I mentioned earlier in my in my session that we've got 3 of my senior management team are retiring, all of whom have come up in 4 months. And I spent a significant amount of time in the lead up to this, because I anticipated it was coming, albeit not in a 4-month window, to build the succession plan within the organisation, specifically and almost entirely focused on ensuring that the culture evolves steadily, rather than it creates an event that damages the culture. So I'm happy for it to improve, I'm happy for it to change, but I'm very conscious that these sort of events can fundamentally negatively affect the culture. So I think, and I'm equally aware that the board knows this. And we had a debate at the board only a few months ago about the merits of doing external hiring for some of the roles. Now, I convinced the board that we'd had a stable management team. This team had been together from day one, that this was the one opportunity in almost 10 years for the next generation to get their chance. And culturally, to say to them, yes, you've waited 10 years, but actually we want to hire somebody from outside, sent a particularly bad message. And I convinced the board that the people were capable enough and that they didn't need to hire from externally. And the pushback from the board, which I think is fair, is yes, that's fine, and we accept that, but that we want you to be ambitious about thinking about what other resource you need, not necessarily filling the specific roles, but are there external people you can hire to provide that extra wow, without taking the same level of risk of shoehorning in somebody into a senior role that could change the culture.
Okay. So I'm quite interested in the idea of the board's view on culture as a risk. And specifically, this is from a conversation I had with the chair, who's like, yes, you'll have the conversations with the CEO, the CFO, but again, as a chair, you probably have a responsibility to try and get feedback from the deeper in the organisation to really understand what's going on.
I mean, I'm coming back to openness and transparency, because without it, you're just wasting your time really in the board discussions. You need that. You absolutely need that. And there has to be a willingness to debate the topic. And I think there's a bit of a dance that goes on in the boardroom sometimes, where you are asking provocative questions of the management, not just the CEO, because you want to see the process through which they have come to their own conclusion, not because you disagree with their conclusion, because you want them to articulate how they got from 0 to 10. How did they get there? Process matters, is what I'm learning as a board member rather than an executive. Process matters, and visibility of the process matters. So back to culture. To get that level of openness, you need a management team who are willing to talk about things at the right time, not when it's finished and they're just presenting it to you to rubber stamp it. They're willing to listen, sometimes to questions that are just there designed to provoke and make them go through the steps rather than contradict them or turn their decision over. And they have to believe they're going to get the right level of feedback from the board. So as the chair, I'm looking at the culture at the board level as well. I'm looking at what happens in that room and what happens between that group of people, as much as I'm looking at how does this business work. I'm lucky at one of my 2 boards in that I'm the designated NED for employee engagement.
Okay.
Which I really enjoy, because I miss working with teams. I really do. I miss people. I like access, people. Yeah. Being on my own, not good. Anyway, so it gives me an access. Yeah. But this is an organisation that I feel has always been very open and transparent, and has always put their people into the room to discuss openly with the board. But I'm now dipping in, and all it's doing for me is just confirming what I already thought we could see at the board, that that little sliver of 5% we can see that is actually what's going on underneath. There is this constant debate, constant discussion, transparency. it gives me a little bit more confidence that they're not going to ignore problems. That's not that
so
kind
you
of
can
company.
trust the information you're getting.
Yeah,
Well.
but I would say in most cases it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
You're always striving for something and improving it.
Do you talk to the CPO? Would you talk to the chief HR officer?
As CEO,
as chair?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I was at a wedding in Italy last week on a Friday. I was sitting by the swimming pool, which was, and the CPO of the business I'm chair rang me up, and it was fantastic. I took the call, no issue at all. But she, because she wanted to ask if I would be happy for her to talk to the private equity owners of the business about how significant the CEOs, how important the CEO is to the organisation and how brilliant he's been at developing the business and building the team, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And I can imagine a number of situations, particularly that sort of circumstance where the chair would say, "Oh no, I'll manage that correspondence." But my view was, no, that's fantastic. It will work two ways. She will be much more passionate in describing me. I will just be merely a conduit of her views. And also, the PE owners will actually see another member of the senior executive and be able to quiz them on the organisation. So I think it's a really great situation.
Okay. I think that's a good place to wrap up. So thank you to Maria and Giles. If you want to hear more, then find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the usual places. Thank you.